I am Inspector, and I solved mystery. Welcome to my new case. It is the rain I remember first. A thin, reluctant drizzle, scarcely more than a mist against the lamps at Oxford Station. It carried the weary smell of diesel and whetstone, and I thought, as I so often do, how English rain never seems to decide whether to fall or merely linger. A half-hearted element, undecided as most of us are. I had no pressing reason to be there, only the idleness of a late afternoon when I had persuaded myself that observation might substitute for action. Trains slid in and out with the groaning punctuality of a tired bureaucracy. Doors thudding open, umbrellas angled like bayonets, the brief choreography of travellers scurrying for warmth. A man cannot haunt stations without summoning private recollections, and mine were of departures poorly spoken, arrivals too late, words unsaid to women, whose faces dissolve now in the steam and gloom. I sat in the draughty shelter, watching an elderly porter chalk numbers with a kind of fatal patience. There was something ecclesiastical about him, as though the trains were prayers and he the only faithful listener. It was there that I noticed the newspaper, left folded on the bench, damp at its corners. I turned it over idly, more for the crossword than the headlines, but a small column caught my eye. Missing Oxford academic. Last seen boarding the 6.12 to Woodstock. I frowned, perhaps at the symmetry of it. A scholar boarding a train that others confirmed, yet vanishing like a line of Greek verse half remembered. His name meant nothing to me then, Dr. Adrian Leland, but the bare fact of disappearance unsettled me. People die, are killed, leave, betray, but vanish. That is a kind of poetry too contrived for the world we inhabit. The drizzle thickened. I watched the train to Banbury heave itself away, its windows smeared gold against the evening. I thought of the word abscond, and then of absence, and then of absolution. The crossword lay beside the article. A single clue at the top had been inked in rather clumsily. A journey never ended. 6. The answer space was blank. I smiled grimly. Whoever had attempted it had not been blessed with the kind of mind for puzzles. Still, the clue lingered, nudging at me with the faint insistence of prophecy. Lewis rang then, his voice brusque as always, unsoftened by rain or reminiscence. "There's been a request from the college, sir. The man's colleagues are worried. The police are treating it lightly, but it feels odd." I told him I was already aware, as though I had intended all along to take notice. He sounded faintly incredulous, which I cannot blame him for. But it seemed to me that the matter had already chosen me, in its quiet, insistent way. I stayed longer than was necessary, watching figures come and go. A woman in a red scarf dropped her ticket stub, bent to retrieve it, and was nearly knocked down by a briefcase-wielding man too intent on his departure. The scarf trailed in the puddles like a discarded signal. I saw in that small, clumsy exchange something of the nature of our inquiries. Fragments, gestures, careless collisions from which we reconstruct a whole. Yet the whole always resists, slipping away just as the scarf slipped free of the woman's glove. By the time I rose, my coat was sodden at the collar. I felt the unease of a case already begun, though not assigned. A man took a train. He carried his coat, his books, his folded umbrella. He bought a ticket, nodded at the guard, settled into his seat. And then, nothing. A gap on the map. I imagined the train drawing into Woodstock, the carriage doors sliding open, the shuffle of passengers disembarking, and one space conspicuously unfilled. The porter was closing his ledger as I passed. He looked at me without curiosity, only the habitual indifference of men accustomed to seeing faces blur by. "Always on time," he muttered to himself. Perhaps about the trains, perhaps about something else. I made a mental note, though I could not have said why. A remark, like a clue, often only reveals its meaning long after it is made. I walked back through the dripping streets, the towers of Oxford half-shrouded, bells muffled by rain. My mind lingered on the crossword clue. 6 letters. A journey never ended. A life uncompleted. The rain pressed harder against my shoulders. as if reminding me that absence is only ever noticed through presence. An empty seat, a wet newspaper, a missing man whose name I did not yet know but would come, inevitably to know too well. Dr. Adrian Leland. The name did not at first carry weight, but names, I have learned, are like doors. Push them gently and they open onto rooms you never imagined. His was such a door. Fair Fellow of St. Crispin's, reader in the classics, a man whose lectures drew a modest but loyal attendance, whose papers were read and then politely shelved. The obituary that was not yet an obituary painted him as diligent, courteous, faintly dull. But dullness is a costume, and men who vanish on trains seldom wear it for long. I walked into St. Crispin's the following morning, the cobbles slick from night rain. The quad was deserted, but for a pair of undergraduates crossing under their umbrellas, their voices lowered in that particular register, reserved for gossip that wishes to seem concern. The chapel bell tolled the hour with a kind of resigned patience. I have always found colleges complicit in silence. Their stone corridors absorb indiscretions like sponges, only to exhale them years later when no one is listening. The porter, Thomas Cleeve, was on duty, and he looked at me as though expecting me all along. He tapped his register with a stubby pencil. Dr. Leland went out as usual, sir. Ticket in his pocket, small case in hand. Always neat, always on time. He did not return. Cleeve said it with the flat finality of a train announcement, yet I felt a hesitation behind the words, a pause a fraction too long before the phrase always on time. I made a note of it, though lightly as one stores away an oddity in a crossword solution that does not quite sit. Leland's rooms faced the inner garden. Fair Don's rooms are never truly private. They are catalogues of allegiances and omissions. His shelves bore the inevitable Plato and Horace, but beside them were detective novels worn at the spine. Her man of riddles, then, though he preferred them solved by others. On the desk lay an appointment diary, the week carefully plotted in neat square hand. Tuesday's entry, 6:12 train, Woodstock. Nothing beyond. The line ended there like the train itself, pulling into an empty station. I sat in his chair, felt the faint indentation of habit. On the mantel stood a photograph of a much younger Leland, cap and gown, smiling in a way he no longer did. Next to it a postcard pinned with a drawing pin, the Parthenon at dusk, the columns painted in a light too golden to be believable. It struck me then that the postcard bore no stamp, no postmark, no address. A message never sent. I wondered to whom it had been intended. Lewis arrived, his shoes squeaking on the flagstones. He said the railway staff had confirmed Leland boarded. The guard remembered his ticket, the booking clerk his folded umbrella. No one recalled him leaving the train. A man may board, I thought, but disembark only in memory. We left the rooms as we had found them. Outside, the air smelled of whetstone and decaying leaves. I asked Lewis what he made of the diary's abruptness. He shrugged, said perhaps the man was careless. But Adrian Leland, from all accounts, was not careless. Men who draw neat lines in diaries seldom are. The absence of words beyond the train spoke more loudly than words could have done. As we crossed the quad, I thought again of the crossword clue from the newspaper. A journey never ended. 6 letters. I tried departure, journey, travel, none fit. Lewis asked what I was muttering, and I said nothing. It is always better to hold the clue close until it begins to whisper back. St. Crispin stood behind us, its windows pale with rain. Somewhere within, voices speculated. Old rivalries adjusted themselves to accommodate tragedy. A man had boarded the evening train and did not alight. That is all. Yet it was enough to alter the geometry of lives. Absence has a weight greater than presence, and it pressed on me now quietly, as the chapel bell tolled once more. It is always the faces that come first. Our case is less a sequence of events than a gallery of portraits, each subject glancing sideways, concealing more than they reveal. In Leland's disappearance, the faces arranged themselves quickly, as though the college itself were curating them for my inspection. Professor Margaret Vale met me in her rooms, which smelled faintly of lavender and old paper. She was precise in manner, like a woman whose sentences had already been drafted in her head. She spoke of Leland as an estimable colleague, reserved but courteous, yet there was a faint brittleness beneath her composure, as if she resented even the memory of him. When she adjusted her spectacles, her hand trembled imperceptibly. She noticed my eyes on the tremor and folded her arms, daring me to ask. I did not. Silence often tells more than questions. Then there was Julian Frobisher, younger by a decade and with the unearned charm of men who mistake indolence for wit. He leaned against the mantel, wineglass in hand, though it was scarcely past noon. Leland, he said, had always taken himself too seriously. He smiled as if at a private jest. I asked if he had seen him that evening at the station. He shook his head with theatrical certainty, but something in his eyes faltered, as though rehearsing a denial too often. His bookshelf held little but thrillers, and a few scattered volumes of poetry, spines uncreased. I thought of the difference between books owned and books read, between appearances kept and truths discarded. Rachel Leland received me at her narrow townhouse off the Banbury Road. She was not the widow yet, but she carried herself as though she had been rehearsing the role for years. Cool, detached, her voice devoid of ornament. We had been estranged, she told me, long before the train. He lived in his books. I lived in my solitude. Her gaze drifted past me to the window, where the rain traced slow rivulets on the glass. There was no grief in her face, but neither was there relief, only a kind of weary completion, as if a chapter already long closed had been given a final punctuation mark. When I asked about a photograph found in his rooms, she paused a fraction too long before saying she did not recall it. That pause, like the blank square of a crossword, invited speculation. And finally Thomas Cleeve, the porter who had first marked Leland's departure. He was a man accustomed to invisibility, whose knowledge of college life came from hearing what was never intended for him. He repeated what he had told me before. Leland, neat as always, coat over his arm, the train on time. Yet when I pressed him on details, what color was the coat, what hat did he wear, he faltered as though memory were a mist he could not push through. I wondered whether he had embellished certainty where none existed, whether always on time was a phrase born of routine, not of observation. Each of them, in their separate ways, offered fragments of a man. The dutiful colleague who inspired envy, the rival whose charm disguised resentment, the estranged wife rehearsing detachment, the porter clinging to routine. None of these portraits aligned, and yet each carried a shadow of motive, a reputation contested, a slight remembered, a love curdled, a truth overheard. I returned that evening to my rooms, weary of their words. On the desk lay the newspaper crossword I had folded away. My eye returned to the unfinished clue. A journey never ended, 6. I tried again. Travel? Journey? Return? None fit. But the thought lingered that Leland's life was itself a clue, and each of these faces part of the solution. The crossword demanded precision, yet human lives seldom oblige. Oxford at night was hushed, the spires blurred by drizzle. I stood at the window, the city stretched like a cryptogram waiting to be solved. Somewhere among those 4 faces lay the answer, though which of them concealed it and why was still hidden in the folds of silence. There is a kind of intimacy in entering another man's study. One feels at once the intruder and the confidant, as if the arrangement of papers, the worn arm of a chair, the faint odor of ink and tobacco were secrets offered reluctantly. Leland's rooms at St. Crispin's were modest, shelves obediently aligned, the desk cleared with pedantic neatness. Yet even in order there are omissions, and omissions are often more eloquent than clutter. It was Lewis who noticed the crossword first. Folded between the pages of a railway timetable, its edges softened by handling, the ink strokes uneven. Most of the grid was vacant, but a handful of words had been tentatively placed. One in particular caught my eye. 6 across, a journey never ended, 6. The squares lay empty, as they had in the newspaper I found at the station. I could not decide whether it was coincidence or continuity, but either way the repetition troubled me. Lewis muttered something about puzzles being a waste of time. I said nothing. To dismiss crosswords is to dismiss the very pattern of human deception, a clue misleading, an answer hidden in plain sight, letters that refuse to align until one small oversight is corrected. I stared at the empty grid until the squares blurred into a map of possibility. The second discovery was accidental. A book of Hausmann, the spine broken from use, had been pushed a little too far back on the shelf. When I eased it free, an envelope slipped onto the carpet. No address, only Adrian written in a delicate hand. Inside, a single page unsigned, its message brief, "Meet me before the train. I cannot wait any longer." Lewis asked if it was a lover's letter. His voice carried a note of suspicion, but I heard only melancholy. The phrasing was impatient yet pleading, the hand too graceful for anger. It spoke of urgency, of a rendezvous that could not be postponed. I imagined Leland at the station, scanning the crowd for a familiar face or perhaps turning away, unwilling to be seen. And then the train and the coat left behind and the empty seat at Woodstock. I folded the letter and replaced it in the envelope. The handwriting nagged at me. There was a flourish to the A that seemed almost theatrical. I tried to recall where I had seen it before, but the memory hovered just beyond reach like a half-remembered line of poetry. That evening I carried both the crossword and the letter back with me. I sat at my desk, the rain beating faintly on the window, and examined them as one examines relics. The crossword spoke of an unfinished riddle, the letter of an unfinished meeting. Both hinted at an incompletion, a narrative broken before its conclusion. I poured a measure of whiskey and leaned back, letting the amber dissolve into silence. The envelope's flap had been torn in haste, not cut. The letter folded with precision, as though the sender believed presentation carried meaning. The crossword, by contrast, was clumsy, almost childlike. Yet they belonged together, artifacts of a life suddenly discontinued. I tried again with the clue. 6 letters, a journey never ended. The obvious answer, eternal, almost fit, but the last square resisted, mocking me with its emptiness. I left it blank as Leland had done, the unfinished word hovering like a ghost between us. The night deepened. Oxford lay still outside, the streets glistening with rain. I thought of the anonymous hand that wrote the letter, the eyes that scanned for Leland at the station, the silence that followed when he boarded and did not return. Absence pressed itself into every corner of the room. The crossword lay before me, its empty squares a mute rebuke, and I knew, as surely as I knew the taste of whiskey on my tongue, that the missing answer was not a word at all, but a life cut short in transit. The trouble with charm is that it behaves like polish. It glints. It slips. It refuses to hold a fingerprint. Julian Frobisher greeted me in the senior common room with the air of a man arriving for applause. He stood beneath a portrait of a benefactor and asked whether I had come to extinguish a scandal or to kindle one. I told him I was listening. I let him talk because talkers eventually edit themselves into confessions. He called Leland industrious to a fault, admirable in footnotes, intolerable at dinner. Their quarrel, he said, concerned a lecture series. He wanted flair. Leland wanted accuracy. He claimed not to have seen Leland at the station. While he spoke, he polished the rim of an empty glass. The gesture troubled me. Men polish glasses when they wish to erase something else. A junior lecturer drifted in and practiced indifference. Frobisher's voice altered for the spectator, lighter, cleverer. When the room had thinned, he added as if idly that Leland had been harried by anonymous letters about some forgotten indiscretion. I asked if he had seen one. Only the effect, he said. Lewis and I went to his alibi. The student's name was Ellis, sincere and apologetic. He said he had spent the early evening with Frobisher reading Catullus, bitter Latin, proving useful for examinations, and less useful for happiness. There was wine. Time mislaid its outline. Yes, he supposed he could vouch for his tutor until a little after 6. When pressed, sincerity hardened into obstinacy. Back in the quad, the rain resumed. I stood beneath the cloister and tested the fit of this ready-made solution. Frobisher irritated me the way a half-solved clue does. Letters appear to align, meaning refuses. His ridicule of Leland, the needless polishing, the mention of anonymous letters, together they offered the detective's equivalent of an off-the-peg suit. Wearable, but never really yours. In Leland's diary I had seen a faint smear where the word train was written, as though a damp finger hovered, considering. On his desk lay a letter opener shaped like a Roman dagger, heavy enough to bruise. At the station, the ticket clerk recalled a quarrel near the newsstand, one man wearing an expensive scarf. Frobisher wore such scarves as naturally as other men wear gilt. The constellation invited a conclusion. Argument, blow, body lost between carriages, the culprit return. I rehearsed this tidy geometry and felt the comfort that falsehoods often provide. Lewis, who distrusts comfort, said he preferred a fact. He produced one. The guard's log recorded a brief stoppage outside Yarnton for a signalling fault. During the lull, a passenger door had been found ajar. Frobisher's name gleamed then like an answer written too early into the grid. 6 letters. A journey never ended. Cancel, abort. Neither would sit. The squares kept their silence. We returned to Frobisher. He entertained an audience that laughed on cue. I asked where the scarf from 2 nights before had gone. He looked briefly blank, then produced one from a drawer far too dry for the week we had endured. I touched the wool. Sandalwood, not rain. Gallus, cornered gently on the stair, admitted their tutorial had ended earlier than he wished to confess. He had left mortified, carrying a book he had not paid for. We almost set the machinery in motion. Almost. As we stepped into the stairwell, I glanced back at the benefactor's portrait. A fine line of dust ran along the frame, broken by a thumb-shaped clean patch. Someone had adjusted the canvas not to tidy, but to conceal a crack in the plaster, where a shallow safe sat buried. Frobisher followed my eyes, and for the first time his charm malfunctioned. It was not violence he had polished away, but debt. Inside the cavity lay receipts and markers. Bookmakers, wine merchants, a pawnbroker on the Cowley Road. Enough motive for deceit, not enough for blood. We left him counting his explanations. Outside, the rain worked at the stones with patient fingers. In my pocket, the folded crossword remained unresolved. And the door I imagined swinging on the darkened carriage swung again, open, shut open, while the answer, so nearly convenient, declined to arrive yet. There are moments in an inquiry when the past arrives uninvited, slipping beneath the door like a draught you cannot block. The photograph appeared in such a manner. Lewis had found it, almost sheepishly, among Rachel Leland's papers, one of those accidents the police prefer to call thoroughness. He handed it to me in the drizzle outside her house, the edges already softening in the damp. A younger Adrian stared back at me, cap and gown, the smile of a man not yet claimed by disappointment. Beside him stood a woman. Dark hair swept to the shoulder, eyes fixed on the camera with that peculiar mixture of confidence and shyness that photographs preserve more faithfully than memory. The pose was intimate but not quite affectionate. And there was something else. The photograph had been cropped rather crudely, as though a third figure had once completed the tableau and had been cut away with deliberate haste. Rachel's sitting room was scented faintly with lilies, though none were present. She sat rigidly, hands folded, eyes trained not on me but on the mantel where a clock ticked too loudly. I showed her the photograph. She looked, and for a fraction of a second her composure wavered. Then the mask returned. "I don't remember that one," she said, her tone flat, rehearsed. I did not believe her. I asked who the woman was. She shrugged, as though the effort of speculation cost her more than honesty would have. A cousin, perhaps, or a student. Adrian collected such things, photographs and dedications. Her eyes shifted then, just slightly, towards the window. A gesture too brief for most, but it caught me. Guilt often looks outward, as though searching for an escape route. Lewis, ever the practical one, muttered that it might mean nothing. But nothing has a weight of its own. The cropped edge told me more than her denials. To excise a face from a picture is an act of violence as subtle as any I know. It says this person no longer exists, not for me. I traced the uneven cut with my thumb and wondered what history had been removed. That night I placed the photograph beside the crossword still unfinished on my desk. Both documents resisted solution. A journey never ended. 6. A smile that no longer belonged to anyone living. I stared at them as though one might illuminate the other. The symmetry unnerved me. I remembered then a remark Frobisher had made in the common room, delivered with the air of idle gossip. Leland had always been rather fond of his shadows, he said, and then laughed at his own cleverness. I had dismissed it as arrogance, but now it returned sharper. Fond of his shadows. Was this woman one of them? A shadow kept in cropped photographs and concealed drawers. I poured myself a measure of whiskey and thought of Rachel again. Her denial had been too swift, her gaze too evasive. Not ignorance, but fatigue, perhaps. The fatigue of remembering what she would rather excise. And yet there had been no accusation in her voice, no venom. Only weariness. A woman who had rehearsed estrangement so long it had calcified. Still, the photograph would not release me. The woman's eyes lingered. I thought of the railway station, of the anonymous letter urging him to meet before the train. A face erased, a meeting demanded, a journey unended. Threads, perhaps unconnected, perhaps indivisible. Outside my window, Oxford lay dark, the spires dim silhouettes against a sky heavy with rain. The photograph leaned against the glass on my desk, reflecting back two faces, hers frozen in time and mine blurred by the night. I could not decide which held more absence, and so I sat with the image, the cropped edge biting at me like a miswritten clue, whispering that the answer lay not in what was shown, but in what had been removed. There is something indecent about reading another man's diary, but I have never believed in the sanctity of ink. A diary is not confession nor truth. It is performance, often written with an imagined reader in mind. Still, in Leland's case, I hoped for something unvarnished, some hint of what had driven him to a train he never left. The book itself was plain, its binding worn, the cover smelling faintly of dust and leather polish. The entries were neat, precise, the kind of hand that measures its strokes. And yet when I turned to the week of his disappearance, I found the rhythm broken. 2 pages had been excised neatly, with the precision of a razor blade. The remaining stubs of paper told me more than their absence should have done. Leland had not torn them out in anger. They had been removed with deliberation. Lewis stood at the window, arms folded, his reflection faint against the rain-dappled glass. He said perhaps Leland had destroyed them himself. Perhaps the missing pages contained only melancholy, a private despair. He suggested suicide with the bluntness of a man who prefers facts to speculation, but I shook my head. Suicide, yes, but not like this. Not with a diary left behind, pages tidied away. Those who plan to leave the world seldom curate their remains with such elegance. A final letter, perhaps. Not an edited journal. The missing pages were not confession. They were concealment. I turned back to the earlier entries, tracing the arc of a man's days. A lecture delivered, a dinner declined, an allusion to a debt repaid. Then, in mid-March, a line that made me pause. Vale presses me again. Cannot continue. The name underlined, the ink darker, as if the pen had hesitated and pressed too firmly. Margaret Vale, her neat rooms, her trembling hand. I remembered her voice, suggesting with too much eagerness that Leland might have ended things himself. The next entry was more oblique. The reckoning approaches. I am not ready. No further explanation. And then silence, until the week of his disappearance and the abrupt surgical absence of 2 pages, Lewis asked what I thought. I told him nothing, only that it was worth considering why a man who wrote with such precision would allow such a gap to remain visible. If one truly wished to erase, one would burn the book, not prune it. To leave a wound is to invite attention. Perhaps he wanted someone to see that something had been hidden. Later that evening, I carried the diary back to my rooms. I laid it beside the crossword, the photograph, the letter, each fragment incomplete, each withholding its conclusion. The crossword still resisted me. 6 letters. A journey never ended. I tried again. Remain, endure, stasis. Each fell short. I poured whiskey and let the wordless squares stare back at me. My mind drifted to the photograph of the cropped woman. Could she have been mentioned in those missing pages? Or was it Vale's name that had returned again and again, sharpened into accusation? I imagined the razor slicing the paper, the stubs left jagged and accusing. Concealment performed in plain sight. There was another detail. On the inside back cover, pressed faintly into the leather, an indentation of writing transferred from a page now gone. The light caught it obliquely. I fetched a pencil and shaded gently until words surfaced like ghosts. Only fragments owed. Stolen. Mine by right. No names, no dates, but enough to suggest not despair but conflict. Outside, the rain had ceased, leaving the city gleaming under a reluctant moon. I thought of Leland, the orderly scholar boarding the train with his folded umbrella and his small case. A man too precise to leave stubs of paper, unless he wished them noticed. A man caught between silence and exposure. The diary lay open on my desk, its gap speaking louder than any entry. I felt again the weight of absence. The seat left empty at Woodstock, the face cropped from the photograph, the unfinished crossword clue. Each absence pointed faintly towards presence, towards something or someone waiting, unresolved, beyond the edge of what was written. And I, staring at those excised pages, knew that we were not yet reading the diary of a man who had chosen to end his life, but of one who had been silenced mid-sentence. Weariness has its own gravity. After days of walking the cloisters of St. Crispin's, of listening to carefully rationed words that revealed less than silence itself, I felt the weight of it pressing on me. Fatigue breeds certainty, and certainty is the most dangerous condition for a detective. I found myself convinced I had solved it. The photograph cropped with deliberate cruelty. The letter urging a meeting before the train. The excised diary pages whispering of debts and betrayal. So it seemed obvious. Adrian Leland had not disappeared but absconded, abandoning Oxford and its quarrels to resume an old affair. The woman in the photograph was no cousin, no forgotten colleague, but the hidden lover who had waited long enough. Together they had conspired, her letter the summons, his absence the answer. I told Lewis as much, late one evening when the lamplight burned low and the smell of damp coats filled the air. He frowned, patient in the way only he could be, and asked if I was certain. Certainty, I reminded him, was the nearest thing to truth. But even as I spoke, I heard the arrogance in my tone, and I disliked myself for it. Still, I built my case with the precision of a crossword half filled. The woman's eyes in the photograph seemed to demand continuation. The cropped edge signified a life severed, a replacement sought. The letter proved urgency. The diary's missing pages suggested preparation, and the journey never ended. 6 letters, could it not be escape? I wrote it in pencil, 6 neat squares across. For the first time the grid looked whole, but then came Lewis, quiet as ever, holding the photograph under the study lamp. He pointed to the hairstyle, bouffant, swept high in a fashion that belonged to the late 60s. Would a lover, still waiting after decades, remain unchanged in a photograph yellowing with age? He asked the question gently, without triumph, but it was enough to unsettle the neat geometry I had built. I took back the photograph and looked again. He was right. The hair, the cut of the dress, the tint of the paper, every detail conspired against my theory. This was not a recent lover. This was history, not continuation. I had misread the clue. I had forced the answer into the grid because I was tired of blank spaces. That night, I stared at the crossword until my eyes blurred. Escape sat there smugly, but the letters no longer convinced me. It was the wrong word, the wrong meaning, the wrong path entirely. A journey never ended. Was it not instead a life cut short rather than extended? I poured another whiskey and let the city settle into its midnight quiet. Outside, the stones sweated with rain. Inside, the photograph lay between us like a mirror turned the wrong way round. I thought of Rachel, her gaze sliding to the window rather than at the image. I thought of Vale, her tremor hidden behind folded arms. I thought of Frobisher, polishing his glass to erase the truth beneath. And I thought above all of the diary, its pages excised with surgical calm, leaving behind only the shadow of what had been removed. The temptation of false solutions is their elegance. They give rest to the weary. They lull the restless mind into believing the story is complete. Yet it is the unfinished clue that contains the truth, however stubborn. I closed the diary, folded the photograph, and erased escape from the crossword, leaving 6 squares once more blank and accusing. Sleep would not come. In the silence I heard again the porter's remark. Always on time, never missed a stop. I had dismissed it as routine, but now it pressed at me like a whisper behind the wall. Something somewhere had been overlooked, and the answer when it came would not arrive in neat pencil strokes, but in the jagged space where certainty collapses into doubt. Weariness loosened the knot without untying it. I had rubbed out escape from the grid, and with it the comfort of a tidy lie. What remained was incompletion. I went back to the station at dusk. Oxford after rain smells like memory. Wet iron, old stone, the vinegar of newsprint. A train idled. Another arrived with a sigh. Softly, Thomas Cleeve was chalking times on the blackboard, the figures leaning. He did not see me until the chalk snapped. Always on time, he muttered. Never missed a stop. He had said it before, the way porters praise good trains and good men. Yet the phrase rang differently now. When was Leland always on time, I asked. Even as a student, sir, Cleeve said. Same carriage when he could, second from the rear. He liked the last minutes before the stop, coat on early, standing by the doors. Habit. I stood where those doors would open. A man who stands before the stop means to be seen or not to be seen at once. The announcement board clicked like a metronome. I unfolded the crossword and looked again at the 6-letter void. A journey never ended. I had treated it as definition. I had not treated it as instruction. Never ended is cryptic for remove the final letter. The answer was truncation, Odyssey without its end. 6 letters, as Leland would prefer, Odyssey. A journey never ended. On his wall, a Parthenon postcard bore no postmark. In his diary, the week ended with a cut. At the station, an empty seat arrived without its passenger, ending by interruption. And Cleeve's phrase returned, second from the rear. At Yarnton, the guard's log recorded a brief halt and a door found ajar, a rear coach door. I could hear the clatter, feel the tug a man might indulge while waiting to alight. I phoned Lewis and asked him to meet me on the footbridge. He arrived damp. What am I looking at? He said. Only this, I told him. The habit of standing becomes fatal when the train does not quite arrive. A half-secured door can masquerade as readiness. An odyssey can end because someone believes the platform has begun. You are making the victim complicit, he said. I'm admitting that no murderer is required to start a fall, I answered. He looked at me, then nodded toward the road to Woodstock. A number plate gleamed. I had seen it in the porter's book beside the visitor's pass. Monsieur Vale, Blue Saab, last Thursday. Along the road, a low railing bore a pale scrape, blue paint braided into rust. I touched the thread with my thumb. Vale had been there, near the halt, near the place where a door might become a mistake or an argument. Back at St. Crispin's, her room smelled of lavender and paper. Have you news? She asked, and when I said not news but a question, she smiled without warmth. Her phrasing was careful, the way a scholar repairs a quotation. She spoke of Leland's gifts and defects. Yet when she reached for Houseman, lads that will die in their glory, she added a beat the poet never wrote. It snagged in my ear. A classicist does not misremember cadence unless her mind is elsewhere. I told her idly that cryptic clues hide the answer in their command. Which command, she said. Never ended, I replied. She folded her hands. For a second the tremor returned. Lewis read my silence and said we would speak tomorrow. Dusk thickened. Bells moved in slow conversation above the roofs. At the gate I read the letter to Leland again, the hand urging him to meet before the train. The flourish on the A overwrought, theatrical, matched the flourish in Vale's marginal notes from the library, the same pressure on the downstroke, the same small collapse at the tail. Perhaps nothing, I told myself. Everything that matters begins as perhaps nothing. Yet Cleeve's habit, the rear door, Vale's plate by the halt, the scraped railing, the misremembered Houseman, the half-ended Odyssey, these small dissonances began to keep time together. The tune was unfinished, but it had found its key, and somewhere beyond the sidings the night air held its breath. It is never the present that condemns us, but the remnants of the past we thought decayed. Leland's disappearance was a puzzle of fragments, yet each pointed backward rather than forward. The photograph, the cropped edge, the letter urging haste, the diary wound opened by a razor, all of them looked less like beginnings than belated echoes. I returned to the college library that afternoon, its air heavy with dust and silence. Shelves leaned into each other as if conspiring, and the faint scratch of a student's pencil was the only evidence of life. There, in a box of departmental papers, I found what I had not been searching for, an early article attributed to Margaret Vale. The subject was an obscure fragment of Euripides. The scholarship seemed precise, but the phrasing tugged at me. I had read it before, not in her clipped voice, but in Leland's steadier prose. He had written those words years earlier, in a minor journal long forgotten. I placed the two texts side by side, and saw the lines march in quiet imitation. Plagiarism, concealed until someone remembered. I left the library with the article folded beneath my coat. Rain had begun again, thin needles against the paving stones. As I crossed the quad, I recalled the phrase in Leland's diary, "Vale presses me again, cannot continue." He had discovered or rediscovered that her academic standing rested on his own foundation. And she, fierce, brilliant, unyielding, had seen the cliff edge of exposure yawning beneath her feet. In her rooms that evening, Margaret Vale looked older than she had before. The lavender scent clung more heavily, as though masking something sour beneath. I laid the article on the desk, beside the unopened bottle of sherry. She glanced at it, then at me. Her mouth tightened. "He meant to destroy me," she said. He had promised once to let it rest, but promises erode. He would not forgive. Her voice did not rise, but the stillness around it deepened. I asked her about the train, about Woodstock, about the quarrel reported near the newsstand. She admitted she had followed him there, hoping, she said that word softly, almost ironically, hoping to persuade him. But persuasion is fragile when pride has been threatened. He mocked her, she said, reminded her of the theft, of her career balanced on false ground. She placed her hands flat on the desk, knuckles pale. He would not relent. It was not confession, not yet. Only the shadow of one. She said she had only wished to delay him, to make him listen, to remind him of what exposure would do not only to her but to the college, to reputations wider than her own. But there was the quarrel, and there was the carriage door found ajar, and there was the silence that followed. I remembered Cleeve's phrase, "Never missed a stop." Leland had stood ready to alight, coat folded, umbrella in hand. One push, one grasp too tight, and the Odyssey never ended. Lewis shifted uneasily in his chair. He disliked such talk, disliked that I allowed her pauses to breathe rather than demand clarity. But the truth in Oxford seldom arrives fully spoken. It drips like rain through stone. shaping the silence more than the sound. I left her then, the article still on her desk, the silence intact. Outside, the bells tolled, their notes dampened by mist. I thought again of the cropped photograph. The face beside Leland's, not a lover but his sister, dead these many years. Rachel had not wanted the past stirred. Vale had feared it. Yet it was the past that had entered the train with him, not the future. And so I walked through the drizzle, knowing only this. Adrian Leland had boarded his last journey carrying not a case, but the weight of memory, and Margaret Vale had met him there with hers. Whether accident or intent, persuasion or pride, the past had claimed them both. It is the quiet ones who confess, not in words but in the faltering of them. By the time we returned to Vale's rooms, the evening had sunk into that peculiar Oxford gloom, when the lamps make the mist appear thicker, not thinner. Lewis walked a pace behind me, his reluctance unspoken. He dislikes endings, especially those that come not with certainty but with resignation. Margaret Vale was seated at her desk, as though she had not moved since our last visit. A pile of papers sat neatly arranged, and beside them the article I had left. She touched it absently, not to hide it, not to discard it, but almost as if it were a relic. When we entered, she did not rise. She asked if I had come to arrest her. I told her I had come to listen once more. The distinction seemed to weary her more than accusation would have done. She began not with Leland, but with herself. She had been overlooked, she said, passed over for promotions, for fellowships, for recognition. Men quoted one another, dined with one another, advanced one another. She had worked twice as hard, written twice as carefully, yet it was always Leland who received the nod. The paper she had borrowed, stolen, she admitted, was her revenge and her salvation. Without it she would have remained unnoticed. With it she became indispensable. I asked her of the station. She closed her eyes as if summoning the picture. He laughed at me, she said, laughed as though my whole career were a footnote he could erase with a pen. He stood by the door, ready to leave, coat folded, umbrella neat. I only wished to stop him, to make him listen. She paused then, her hands clenched together on the desk. But he would not listen. Lewis shifted, and for a moment I feared he might press her, demand the blunt confession. But I raised a hand and we waited. Her voice softened. I touched his arm, perhaps too hard, perhaps not. He staggered, the train lurched, the door. She broke off. The sound that followed was not weeping, not even remorse, but the faint sigh of someone whose silence has been heavier than speech. There was no triumph in me, only fatigue. I thought again of the crossword clue. A journey never ended. Leland's odyssey had been cut short not by fate, but by pride, by the smallest of gestures on the narrowest of thresholds. 6 letters, finish except it had never been written in. We left her then to gather her coat. The porter watched us pass through the lodge, his eyes downcast. He knew, of course. Porters always know. Lewis walked in silence until we reached the car. He said it might have been accident, might have been panic, might have been neither. I agreed. The law requires categories. Life rarely provides them. In the station office later, while Vale waited in the adjoining room, I stood by the window and watched a train pull in. Doors opened with their familiar hiss. Passengers spilled out, some weary, some eager, all with their destinations intact. Only one door remained unused, second from the rear. Always on time, never missed a stop. The porter's words repeated themselves until they became unbearable. When we returned to her, she did not resist. She asked only that the newspapers not call it murder. I told her the newspapers call everything murder, because it sells copies. She nodded as if expecting nothing less. Lewis read her the formalities, his voice low, almost apologetic. She accepted them like a scholar accepting footnotes to an argument already lost. As we led her out, the rain began again, soft as breath on the stones. I thought of the cropped photograph, the missing diary pages, the half-finished crossword. Absence had been the grammar of this case. Absence and silence. And now it was absence again that followed us into the night. The absence of Adrian Leland stepping from the train, the absence of Margaret Vale's career, the absence of certainty in what had truly happened in those few seconds of quarrel, a quiet arrest then. No handcuffs, no shouts, no crowd. Only the sound of shoes on wet pavement, the smell of rain, and the knowledge that an ending, however quiet, is still an ending. The city was hushed when I boarded the late train, the platforms half deserted, the lamps dripping a weary yellow across the rails. I carried no case, only the folded crossword, still unfinished, and the ache of a conclusion that felt less like truth than like resignation. The carriage was warm, air heavy with the lingering breath of travellers already gone. I sat alone as Leland must once have done, staring through glass blurred by rain. Journeys at night encourage reflection. The blurred countryside, hedges dissolving into darkness, fields stretching without horizon. It is like riding through one's own memory, half recognized and half invented. I thought of Adrian Leland waiting by the second carriage from the rear, coat folded neatly, his umbrella balanced against the seat. A man poised for departure, held in that fragile suspension between leaving and arriving. And then the quarrel, the lurch, the door. A journey ended not by destination, but by interruption. Lewis had said earlier that evening that justice seldom satisfies. I had not answered him. What could I have said? That I believed Vale's push had not been intended as murder, but as assertion, as the final desperate gesture of someone who feared erasure more than guilt. That Leland himself, always orderly, had left his diary wounded on purpose. The missing pages not destroyed but advertised as absence? That the crossword clue unsolved by him and by me mocked us both with its insistence that some journeys are only comprehensible when unfinished. I stared at the puzzle once more. 6 letters. A journey never ended. I tried endings again. Odyssey, remain, unstop. None held. I let the pencil rest. Perhaps it had never been meant to be solved. Perhaps the answer lay in the silence of the squares themselves, in the refusal of language to contain what had happened between one stop and the next. The train slid into a brief halt at a country station. Doors opened. No one entered. Rain tapped at the roof, a whisper fainter than thought. I wondered if Leland had felt in those final seconds. The same suspension I felt now. The strange stillness when a train pauses in darkness, neither gone nor arrived, the rails humming with possibility. When we drew into Oxford at last, I did not move immediately. The lamps on the platform shimmered through the mist. Footsteps echoed purposeful elsewhere. I remained seated, the crossword on the table beside me, the whiskey flask unopened in my pocket. A porter passed along the platform, his chalkboard tucked beneath his arm. Always on time, he had said, and yet nothing. Not trains nor lives arrives exactly when expected. I thought of Vale in her cell, lavender scent already fading from her memory. Of Rachel, staring through rain-streaked windows at a life she had abandoned long before it abandoned her. Of Frobisher, polishing glasses to disguise his debts. Of Cleeve, repeating his phrases as though routine could guard against tragedy. Fair college full of silences, each carrying its own unfinished journey. The train hissed once more, preparing to depart again into the night. I gathered nothing, for there was nothing to gather. I let the crossword slip from the seat onto the floor, face up, its squares empty, its clue unresolved. Someone else would find it in the morning, puzzle over it, perhaps fill in an answer, perhaps not. I stepped onto the platform. The rain was falling harder now, soaking the stone, painting it darker than shadow. Bells tolled across the spires, low and distant, as though calling for a man who would never arrive. I pulled my coat close and walked slowly towards the exit, each step echoing against the silence. Journeys end, but not neatly. Some halt without warning, some vanish between carriages, some leave only an absence in a seat. I lit a cigarette I did not finish, and as the smoke curled upward into the damp night, I thought, Perhaps the truest clue is the one we never solve.